All right, pour yourself something because this one starts small and ends somewhere you won't expect. So stay with me. There is a very specific kind of visit that everyone recognizes on sight, even if they've never quite put words to it. It's the visit where someone shows up at your house, says they're just looking around, touches nothing, takes no notes you can see, is unfailingly polite the entire time, and somehow, the second they leave, you find yourself walking through every room checking what they might have been looking at. Not because they did anything wrong, because you can't shake the feeling that just looking around was never really the whole story. That is more or less what happened in 4 cities in Michigan this week. And I want to be honest with you up front, nothing dramatic occurred. Nobody was arrested, no ballots were touched. By every account from the people who were actually there, the whole thing was almost aggressively boring. Which, as I'm going to try to convince you over the next 20 minutes, might be the single most important detail in the entire story. Here's what actually happened, stripped of the noise. On Tuesday, August 4th, Michigan held one of the most consequential primary elections in the country, a governor's race to replace a term-limited Gretchen Whitmer, and a bruising nationally watched Senate primary to fill Gary Peters' open seat. And on that same day, the U.S. Department of Justice announced it was sending federal monitors, lawyers from the Civil Rights Division's voting section, along with staff from Michigan's U.S. Attorney's offices, into exactly 4 cities: Detroit, Hamtramck, Lansing, and East Lansing. Not a random 4, not the whole state. 4 specific heavily Democratic, notably diverse cities, Hamtramck alone being one of the most Arab American and Muslim majority cities in the entire United States. The Justice Department, now run by Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche, framed this in a formal statement as routine oversight, monitoring for compliance with federal voting law. Assistant Attorney General Harmeet Dillon put it this way: the Department of Justice is devoting extensive resources to ensure uniform and non-discriminatory monitoring. Uniform, non-discriminatory. 4 cities out of Michigan's 83 counties. I'll let you sit with that math for a second. Now, before we go further, and this is the part a certain kind of commentator would conveniently skip, let's be fair, because fairness is annoying but necessary. The DOJ, under both parties for decades, has sent election observers into the field. This is not, on its face, some unprecedented invention of the current administration. Election monitoring has a long, largely uncontroversial history in America. So, if this were the whole story, it would be a 2-minute segment, and I'd owe you 18 more minutes of your life back. It isn't the whole story, because attached to the monitors were letters sent to Detroit, Lansing, and East Lansing that didn't just announce a friendly visit. They requested precinct lists, poll worker training materials, and maps of the city's voting locations, and they alleged in writing that these cities had failed to comply with federal election law back in 2024, specifically citing long lines as evidence. The cities in question deny this. Ingham County Clerk Barb Byram, whose jurisdiction includes Lansing and East Lansing, put it about as plainly as an election official is allowed to. The fact that the DOJ felt it was necessary in the first place, it served to cast doubt. That's a local clerk, not a cable news pundit, telling you the letter itself was the message, regardless of what the monitors actually did once they arrived. And what did they actually do once they arrived? This is where it gets almost comically anticlimactic, and I mean that sincerely. Detroit's Director of Elections, Daniel Baxter, said after polls closed, "There were no real issues, and we were pleased." A precinct chair in Hamtramck named Pamela Phelps described her encounter with the monitors like she was describing a pleasant substitute teacher. They introduced themselves and told us they were from Washington. They sat quietly. They watched. In some cases, they asked a few questions about accessibility for voters with disabilities, or about provisional ballot procedures. 2 monitors observed a polling site inside Detroit's Bagley Elementary, sat in the middle of the gymnasium, watched silently, and left politely. By every independent account, and I checked several because a story this clean makes me suspicious, not reassured, the day itself was uneventful. No confrontations, no disruptions, no headlines about intimidation at the ballot box, So here's your first real question of the night, and it's the one I actually want you thinking about, not the manufactured outrage version. If the monitors did nothing alarming, why does this story matter at all? And the honest answer, the one I'd give you even if it made for a less exciting video, because that's sort of the whole deal with this channel, is that it might not matter. It's entirely possible this was exactly what the Justice Department said it was: routine, boring, procedural oversight, executed by career attorneys doing a job that predates this administration by decades. And the letters were just standard issue bureaucratic overreach that happens regardless of who's in the White House. That is a completely legitimate reading of these facts. I want to say that clearly because I'm not in the business of turning nothing happened into something sinister happened, just because sinister gets more clicks. Of course, sinister does get more clicks. I'm aware of the incentive structure I'm operating inside of while telling you this, which is, if you think about it, either refreshingly honest or a very sophisticated way of building credibility before I pivot. You'll have to decide which for yourself. But here's why I don't think you should just relax and move on. And it has almost nothing to do with what happened on August 4th, and everything to do with what happened 5 years, 8 months, and a few weeks before it. In December 2020, a month after Michigan certified Joe Biden's win, a win, by the way, that Donald Trump himself had carried this exact state by roughly 10,000 votes just 4 years earlier, with nobody storming anyone's lawn about it, a crowd of armed protesters gathered outside the home of Michigan's Secretary of State. They were chanting, "Stop the steal." They were standing outside a house where a mother was putting her 4-year-old son to bed. That Secretary of State was Jocelyn Benson. This week, 5 years later, Jocelyn Benson won her party's nomination for governor of Michigan in an 85-15 landslide over Genesee County Sheriff Chris Swanson, one of the widest margins of the entire primary night, in any race in either party. She will now face Trump-endorsed Congressman John James in November. The person the armed crowd gathered to intimidate in 2020 is now, in 2026, the person standing between Donald Trump's chosen candidate and the governor's office of one of the most contested states in the country. If you're the kind of person who believes in narrative irony, this is a genuinely remarkable one. If you're the kind of person who believes in coincidence, well, I suppose someone has to be. And that's really the frame you need to hold on to for the rest of this. Because the 4 cities that got monitors this week, Detroit, Hamtramck, Lansing, East Lansing, aren't just Democratic-leaning. They are, according to lawmakers who raised alarm about the timing, exactly the kind of cities you would target first if you wanted to build a paper trail, precinct maps, training records, a documented history of requests and concerns that could later be cited as justification for something more aggressive in a race that actually matters. Al Jazeera reported that lawmakers and voting rights advocates explicitly warned the monitoring program could be used for what they called partisan aims, precisely because the department, while insisting on neutrality, has spent years operating under a president who has never once, not a single time since 2020, stopped insisting that American elections are rigged against him unless he wins. That's not an opinion I'm smuggling in. That's simply the most consistent policy position of his political career. And a president who has said, out loud, on the record, that he only needed to find a specific number of votes to flip Georgia in 2020 is not a president whose Justice Department gets the benefit of the doubt for free. Trust in this line of work is not a renewable resource. You spend it, and then you don't have it anymore. And then everything you do afterward, even the genuinely boring, genuinely procedural stuff, gets read through the lens of what you spent it on. Now, let's talk about why November is the part that should actually be keeping people up at night. Because a primary in August is, politically speaking, a dress rehearsal. And dress rehearsals exist so you don't improvise on opening night. Michigan in November isn't just electing a governor. The Senate seat being vacated by Gary Peters is one of the most competitive in the entire country. And this week's primary produced a genuine shock. Progressive Abdul El-Sayed defeated the establishment-backed Congresswoman Haley Stevens by a single percentage point, overcoming a nearly $65 million spending disadvantage in the process. He now faces Republican Mike Rogers, a race the Cook Political Report calls a pure toss-up, in a contest that could single-handedly determine whether Republicans hold or lose their 53-seat Senate majority. This is not a low-stakes state having a quiet news cycle. This is one of maybe 3 or 4 places in America where the entire balance of federal power could tip on a margin thin enough to fit inside a single county's counting error. And that is precisely the kind of race where who gets to decide what counts as a voting irregularity stops being an abstract legal question and starts being the whole ball game. So here's the uncomfortable version of the timeline, laid out plainly, no dramatic music required. A president whose signature political claim for 6 years running has been that elections are stolen unless he wins them. A Justice Department run, on an acting basis, by his former personal defense attorney, whose own confirmation has been stalled in the Senate over Republican objections. Objections serious enough that Trump reportedly floated temporarily pulling the nomination rather than lose the votes. A monitoring program that visited exactly the cities you'd expect if the goal were to build a documented case for something bigger later, requesting precinct maps and training materials under an unproven allegation of past noncompliance the cities themselves reject. And a November election in the same state that could decide the U.S. Senate, taking place 3 months after this quiet, polite, thoroughly uneventful trial run. I'm not telling you those dots definitely connect. I genuinely don't know that they do, and anyone telling you with total certainty either way, in either direction, is selling you something. What I am telling you is that if you were designing a scouting mission and you wanted it to look completely innocent, while you figured out exactly how a real operation would need to work in November, this is roughly what it would look like. Quiet, polite, forgettable, which is, of course, the entire point of a scouting mission. It's not supposed to be memorable. It's supposed to be the thing nobody thinks to write about again until it suddenly matters. There's a version of this story where nothing else happens. The monitors go home, the letters get filed, Michigan certifies its results in November the same way it always has. And this segment ages into a mildly overwrought footnote, proof that I, too, occasionally reach for the dramatic reading when the boring one would have done just fine. I'd take that outcome. I'd take it happily. But American elections don't get to plan for the boring outcome anymore, not since a sitting president spent the weeks after losing one trying to find 11,780 votes that didn't exist, and not since armed men stood outside a mother's home because she refused to hand him the ones that did. The Justice Department wants you to believe this week was about nothing. Maybe it was, but nothing has a way of quietly rehearsing itself right up until the one night it decides to become something. And Michigan, whether it likes it or not, has already been cast in that role once before. I'm Marcus Fenn. This is Borderlines. If any of this actually happens in November, you will not be able to say nobody was watching the people who were doing the watching. See you at the next border.